Love podcasts, hate nonces. It's the PoliticsJOE podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
Woo!
And what an awful day for the nonces it is.
A great day to be a nonce hater, because pedos to be castrated, mandatory drugging of perverts, according to the Sun.
What a day. What a day.
Sean Hickey. Nice to
Yes,
be
that's
here
my
with
name.
you. Usually we introduce each other. So.
Yes, we do. Yeah. Laura Beveridge is here, and it's just the two of us on this finest of days. Snap polling to come out soon is going to have Labour on 100%, presumably.
Labour landslide incoming.
The Justice Secretary is going to deliver a statement at some point this afternoon about the mandatory chemical castration of sex offenders.
David Gauke, who's the ex-Justice Secretary, has led an independent sentencing review. And Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood is going to deliver a common statement this afternoon. But ahead of that, the Sun was briefed that she is considering going further than the review, calls for the government to look carefully at a more widespread chemical castration of sex offenders. But Shabana Mahmood would like to go further and is looking to make chemical castration mandatory for some sex offenders, according to the Sun. The biggest part, though, of this independent sentencing review is actually to do with the slashing of custodial sentences, which even up to a third to half of the sentence is to be slashed for a lot of prisoners, which is interesting considering from a polling perspective for Labour, how poorly the early release of prisoners, which we saw just after they came into power, went down with the public. Apart from the winter fuel payment, it's the policy with the second most cut through, and it was entirely negative in terms of what Labour have done so far in their government with the public.
I wonder if this will have less of a negative cut through because of the sheer absurdity of deciding that everybody in a certain sect of the prison population is now going to be forcibly castrated by the state. You know, it's just a very, very base policy that I'm sure, like what you read out earlier on is the headline from the Sun, right? Pedos to be castrated is kind of the headline that I would imagine if you're on the editorial floor of the Sun, it's the kind of headline you've always wanted to put on the front page. And to now have that as a reality I wonder, is it going to be as negative a policy for Labour as the early release of prisoners early on in the...
Well, I wonder if that grabs the headlines, and then the fact that sexual and violent offenders are going to be released early kind of gets swept to the wayside or goes a little less noticed because everyone's just talking about the fact that they're going to allegedly mandatory castrate some of them as well. I think it's interesting because the fact that I was looking at how long the average custodial length is for sex offenders who commit offences against children under 13. And in 2020, the average amount of time they spent in prison was 3 years and 8 months. So if Labour are proposing to cut that by a third or a half, they're only going to spend, 2 years in prison for sexually assaulting a child under 13. That feels like something that's perhaps should be what we're talking about, is the length of custodial sentences, and whether you believe that it's possible to reform someone who does something like that or not. That prison sentence feels too short for either punishment or for any sort of reform or therapy to take place within.
Of course it is. I mean, to have a max, just touching 4 years on average, and as you say, you're not going to serve those 4 years, is a bizarre place to be, to then say we're going to reduce that even more, but there's this payoff. I wonder as well, the way that the DOJ has been kind of approaching prisoner reform and sentencing reform has just been to release people early. And the excuse being prison overcrowding is an issue, the prison population is too large, blah, 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 blah. If you're releasing some people you should be looking at the laws that are in place that have certain people in prison, whether it's for like petty sale of drugs or things like this, right? Rather than halving or thirding the sentences of pedophiles. It's quite strange to say that the only solution is to release people early, rather than looking more deeply at how we imprison people, what we do in communities to prevent crime in the first place. How do we consider things criminal activity? How do we consider, I mean, we'll talk more about a different kind of criminal activity or alleged criminal activity later on. But the way we're approaching criminal justice seems to be completely wrong. Like, I mean, you know, the wife of the Tory councillor that was lost her appeal yesterday, nearly 3 years in prison for...
She's getting as much as a person that sexually assaults a child in prison for the Facebook post.
So like you compare those two things and you wonder, are we doing all of this right? Is any of this done in the correct fashion? And obviously different crimes, different punishments. But I think when it is a case of a couple of posts on Facebook, as inflammatory and as dangerous and as hate-filled as they are, to then have somebody who's guilty of sexual assault against a minor, someone under 13 years old, getting a couple of months more than you is a pretty strange state of affairs for the justice system to be in.
As a society, we can kind of all agree that people who commit violent or sexual offences are exactly the type of people that should be serving custodial prison sentences. But when you look at other things like addiction, like the criminalisation of addiction, surely money that's spent locking these people up, criminalising them for an addiction, could be spent on adult social services, drug prevention services, in fact, looking at decriminalising it completely, or having consumption rooms, like all these different ways that you can prevent harm to both the addict and others without having to impose custodial sentences. And I think in terms of things like the Facebook post, is a prison sentence the best form of justice for that? And I think there's other ways of looking at justice that doesn't involve prisons. In New Zealand, they have a really interesting youth justice system called restorative justice, and it takes from Indigenous people's practices of justice. And one of the things that it involves, and this only happens in, as I understand, in the youth system, is that if a young person commits an offence, rather than sending them to prison for that offence, they'll make them basically sit down with the people they harmed or the victims that they harmed and have like a restorative practice of justice where basically they like explain what happens and they come to a resolution together with the victims. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at something like the Facebook post, like what we're going to talk about later. That's a much more interesting way of addressing harms.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, yeah, I agree with everything you said. On the measures that they're looking to put in, I wonder how that can be extrapolated out for other offences because ultimately, as we said, a lot of the policies around prisons and early releases are to do with overcrowding in prisons. This is one of those that seems to be this is the crime, this is the solution that's directly linked to the crime. Are we going to start cutting the hands off of burglars? Are we going to start... Do you know what I mean? Like, it just seems like a very strange way to move forward. To just say, this is the crime, the punishment is no longer incarceration, it's something else.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, okay, this is one of the most serious crimes anyone can commit. But if you're giving the state the power to make physical changes to somebody's body, it's not too much of a stretch to say we're going into another set of crimes or another set of offences and looking at another way to bring justice, quote unquote, to the people.
I do think with any other set of crimes that they would have a lot less public support for any form of removing of body parts for that crime. Like, it does feel that sexual offences are a particularly unique case, especially in how like the body is used in those offences as the weapon itself.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Shall we move on to talking about a different sort of alleged criminality? Someone else Keir Starmer would like to lock up.
Oh, he loves locking them up. He loves locking them up. So yesterday, Laura, yesterday evening, the Met declared that they are bringing charges against Lim Oana, Lim, otherwise known as Lim Oana.
Or Mokara.
So that statement gets to the root of what's going on here, is that for some strange reason in the United Kingdom in 2025, a group of 20-something-year-old rappers are being held to a higher standard than the government, the Israeli state, the defense ministers, foreign ministers, whatever ministers in Israel that are actively using the language of ethnic displacement and genocide. And instead of holding those people to account, or at least for having some moral consistency over the last 18 months, 2 years, there has been this effort to trawl through old footage from gigs of, again, a music group to see whether a music group is a pro-terrorist organization. It is absurd to have this kind of debate around people whose music have, like, they've always been a controversial band. They have always been a band that treads the line of acceptable political discourse or like radical political discourse. It has been known for a very long time that's what they do. Even in their earliest days, they had their posters of Arlene Foster and Boris Johnson on a bonfire with fireworks strapped to them. Why were they not investigated for terrorism charges then? That was the prime minister of the country that they are governed by and the first minister of the country that they lived in, that they were maybe, if this is terrorism, that could be seen as inciting violence. Why is this coming out now? It's a furore around a banner that they had at Coachella that, by the way, they had at every single gig for the last year. They did it at Glastonbury twice. There was no controversy around it then. For some reason, you make it to America, and then concerts that you've done in the UK are then put under scrutiny. It's just all very confusing and all very twisted. And whether, again, the charges are there. Lim Oana is now, we don't, like, is he going to be on stage tomorrow? What's he going to say on stage tomorrow? Is it going to make things better or worse? It's certainly going to add something to the discourse. But all that's happening now is Kneecap are just being promoted further, and they're getting more notoriety, and they're getting more kind of they've capitalized off of controversy for their entire career. The beginning of the career, I'm sorry, I'm aware that I'm speaking a lot now and you've not said anything in a while, but since the beginning of their career, they were banned from Irish radio before they'd even released an album. They, as I said about the Boris Johnson, Arlene Foster poster, the bringing the British government to court for removing funding from them. All these sorts of things, they've always kind of treaded the line of controversy and acceptable debate and acceptable political thought. And this is kind of a distraction from what they genuinely believe in. Because whether they believe in, if you were to ask me if these guys are going to southern Lebanon to actively push the border of northern Israel back, I would say they're not doing that. They're not terrorists. They're artists that have said something on stage in the heat of the moment, allegedly said something on stage in the heat of the moment. That is all being used as a way to move the dial and move the narrative and move the conversation away from what's actually happening and what they're actually voicing.
I totally agree with them when they say that it is a carnival of distraction. Should he allegedly have picked up and flown a Hezbollah flag on stage at a concert? Absolutely not. That was a mistake. But when they say we're not the story, genocide is, they're absolutely right. When you consider who's committing crimes, who's committing terror. I mean, Starmer yesterday in the Commons was asked by Kirsty Blackman, why is the government still selling Israel parts of F-35 jets? And Starmer said, we're not selling the parts to Israel. We're selling them to America, who are then selling them to Israel, which is a bit like, oh, I didn't shoot the guy, I just handed him the gun, knowing what he was going to do with it. And when you consider that since October 7th, Israel has killed 17,400 children in Gaza, it does raise the question of why are Kneecap the ones here charged with terrorism?
Especially considering, like you mentioned the thing of Kirsty Blackman yesterday, and I mean, I think the guys touched on it yesterday. Actually, will we just play the clip of the interaction at PMQs yesterday?
If the Prime Minister agrees that the Israeli government starving children to death is monstrous, why does he think it's okay for the UK to continue to sell Israel the equipment for the fighter jets to drop bombs on these starving children?
What we contribute into a pot is parts for fighter jets. And if we were to stop that, they couldn't be used by other countries in the other conflicts, including those in which we are involved. It doesn't know the detail at all. They're not sold directly, they go into a pot. If we were to stop that, they wouldn't then be available to others around the world who desperately need them in the conflicts they're engaged in. And that's why we won't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So I think what we learned there was, well, it was more meat on the bone to the question of UK complicity in certainly in arming Israel. People like David Lammy, Hamish Falconer have long kind of prevaricated on that question. And Keir Starmer, for the first time, is then including the presence of a pot that the UK puts ejector seats into and parts for fighter planes, and kind of excusing that these things, because we put them there, and it could be the Ukrainian government that takes an ejector seat, or it could be the American government that takes an ejector seat, and we couldn't possibly know if it's going to Israel or not. It's a bizarre kind of justification of your complicity in what's going on. It doesn't matter if it's a gun or a bullet or a helmet or an ejector seat. You are in some way. I mean, I think it's something like 15% of all F-35 fighter parts come from the United Kingdom. How can you possibly say that you are actively and consciously trying to prevent what Israel is doing, whilst going through every single loophole that you can to continue giving them the means to continue their bombardment and destruction of Gaza?
Exactly. And the pot that he's referencing is Lockheed Martin's Air Force Plant 4 in Fort Worth, Texas, which has been integral to Israel's procurement of fighter jets. I mean, how difficult would it be to say that we're not going to export any F-35 parts to any plant assembling them to then sell, or who has contracts with Israel? They could easily do that, easily. But they're choosing not to. And I think it's just the attitude of like distancing is really strange. We had David Lammy as well responding to Zara Sultana the other day in the Commons when she asked about genocide in Israel, and David Lammy responded with, oh, Zara, you just want a clickbait headline. And she was saying, well, actually, no, I'm asking quite a serious question about the government's policy on this. I mean, should we just have a listen to that as well?
Yeah, why not?
Between October and December 2024, the government approved over £127 million in export licences to Israel, exceeding the combined total under the Tories for 2020 to 2023. These licences, granted after the government's so-called temporary suspension, include components for lethal F-35 fighter jets. Jets Israel is now flying at 5 times the usual rate, decimating Gaza. Children are starving, families have been wiped out, hospitals destroyed, yet the government in court claims that there is no evidence Israel targets civilians. The Foreign Secretary is personally responsible and refuses to ban all arms sales to this genocidal state. So, like many across Britain, I have to ask the Foreign Secretary, how do you sleep at night?
Well, the Honourable Lady has raised figures that I don't recognise. She's raised once again the issue of arms sales to Israel. I banned arms sales that could be used in Gaza. I know that the Honourable Lady is keen on clickbait, but I'm not going to be baited from this dispatch box.
It's bordering on disgusting the way the UK government, and look, Metropolitan Police, semi-independent from the UK government, we're not saying that Keir Starmer is charging Lim Oana for potential terrorism offences, but it is an interesting contrast between the two, that this is what, and also during that debate that Lammy was replying to Zara Sultana on, the nerve to turn around to Priti Patel after she asks a question about, now the question in the context of the UK then finally taking a stand against Israel, to then reply to Priti Patel, who was kind of continuing the line that Labour and the Conservatives have kind of had for the last year and a half, 2 years, for Lammy to turn around and act as though he has been a pro-Palestinian voice, stop the war voice, condemning Israel voice for the last 2 years, the nerve to act as though you have been the paragon of righteous and moral standing against the Israeli government's actions in Gaza. It is bizarre to see how the government themselves and the British media as a whole has kind of just flipped the switch on how they talk about this. And how they kind of approach the conduct of the Israeli government. It's no longer this, well, but they're trying to rid Gaza of Hamas.
Israel
It's no
has the right
longer
to defend
that.
itself.
Yeah, it's been that for 2 years, despite how many people have died, despite how many children have died, despite how little aid gets through, despite the active and regular statements of like purposeful ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. And now, because the government has changed their tune on it, the media is starting to change its, but not even so much, just still parroting government lines, just in a different way. It's just leaning in a more favourable position to the Palestinians now.
Definitely. I mean, because this kind of tone shift came on Monday, really, with this joint letter from France, Canada, and the UK, which was in relation to Israel's Operation Gideons Chariot, which is that they are now no longer just going to operate kind of raids in Gaza and then leave. They're going to stay and occupy, as well as that any aid that was getting into Gaza would have to go through Israeli hubs rather than being distributed by the UN. And that led to this statement being made that yesterday's announcement that Israel will allow a basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate. We call on the Israeli government to stop its military operations in Gaza and immediately allow humanitarian aid to enter. This must include engaging with the UN to ensure the return to delivery of aid in line with the humanitarian principles. And that came out at around the same time as this UN statistic that 14,000 children would die in the next 48 hours if the aid blockade wasn't stopped. And I think that kind of triggered something, because then we saw Lammy sanction West Bank settlers, including Daniela Weiss, who was featured in the Way Through documentary, and the UK suspended trade negotiations with Israel over the blockade as well. And that is obviously very significant things, but like you mentioned, this isn't, Gideon's Chariot is new, but the intentions to occupy and settle areas designated by the UN to the Palestinian people has been going on before October 7th as well. So it feels a bit arbitrary that this is the line they've chosen. And if anything, it feels exactly like Omar El-Akkad's book, who Ollie interviewed him last year. It's a really good interview and you should go and watch it. But his argument is that one day everyone will have always been against this. It's that basically the West and the liberal West like to rewrite history around its interventions, especially in the Middle East, to make them look like they were always on the right side of history. I mean, even if you look at how the intervention in Iraq is spoken about now, or was even spoken about during the latter years of the intervention as a humanitarian intervention, when if you go back and you read why the initial justifications for invading Iraq, the fact that it was part of this axis of evil and terror and it was a terrorist state, that's completely different to a humanitarian intervention, which you have post facto written it to be. And Omar's book is all about this kind of liberal hypocrisy. And he's basically saying that one day every liberal Western state will have said, yeah, it was always a genocide and we were always against it, which it's definitely going to be. And I found that kind of, when I spoke to Sarah Champion at the beginning of the year, and I said, here's all the evidence that the UN have provided that there is a genocide going on in Gaza. Those are all the facts. Why won't you call it a genocide? And she said, oh, because that has to be ruled on by the ICC. Only the ICC can declare it a genocide. It's just the fact that it's only after the fact that the liberal West can apply this language to what's happening.
But yet South Africa can still take a case of genocide against Israel. In the meantime, you can support that case.
Exactly.
That's what you can do. You don't need to say, we will wait until the ICC rules on something. We can say, as a liberal democracy that believes in the rule of law and the right of place and peace to any person, what is happening is an abomination and we want to be on the right side of it. Right side of history, not right side of the abomination. And also, like, with Omar Al-Akkad's thesis, it is also going to be increasingly difficult for these governments to kind of change the face of history in that way. Because, I mean, particularly with the UK, you've had ample opportunity at the UN Security Council at the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024 and midway through 2024 to vote in favor of a ceasefire, to vote in favor of condemnation. And at every opportunity, the UK abstained along with the United States. So the evidence is there, and the evidence will not be wiped from history that the UK stood by while this was happening. And it's only now, when it's almost too late, to turn around and say, well, actually, what's happening now is wrong. Now and only now what's happening is wrong. Not since 1967, not since 1945, never. None of these things that have happened, according to the way the UK is presenting itself now, have been wrong. The UK is now saying the aid being held, the aid not getting through is the only thing that's wrong about this. Having not stood up at the UN Security Council, having not supported the ICC genocide case. And to go back to Kneecap briefly, this narrative around media personalities in the UK, where whether it's Gary Lineker, whether it's Kneecap, whether it's anybody, that for some reason the people who speak out against what the established norm is, i.e. the media established line on whether we are supportive of Israel or whether we're going to start pushing back on Israel for their conduct in Gaza. It's telling that football pundits, that music acts, that these kinds of people are the ones that are being held to account rather than the Prime Minister of the country or the Prime Ministers of other countries.
Absolutely. And the fact that they're being charged and losing their jobs is very telling. And I think also the fact that we know that the British state can act with just suspected violations of international law, because when David Lammy suspended the export licenses of some pieces of military equipment, that was because there was suspected violations of international law. Surely, even if you can't call it genocide because it hasn't been ruled so in an international court, surely suspected genocide is just as good of a reason to suspend all sales.
Absolutely. Shall we wrap up?
We shall.
Let's do it.
That was heavy.
It was heavy, but it was good. It was good and important. We hope you enjoyed that, dear listener, dear viewer. We will see you after the long weekend.
Yeah, have a good bank holiday.
Yeah. Bye-bye.